This presentation is going to be Breaking the Unbreakable System by James Denaro and Matthew Green. So please welcome them with a warm applause. Thank you.
So we are going to be talking today about key escrow and the problems that face governments and companies as we start to see end-to-end encryption take over everywhere. We're not going to be hacking anything, unfortunately, so if anyone's here to see something interesting happening with a Jeep, you might be in the wrong place. But if you were trying to see that and you're here, well, hopefully you'll like this as much. So go ahead.
All right, thank you. So I'm Jim Denaro. I'm an information security, data privacy, and intellectual property attorney out of Washington, D.C. And with me is Matthew Green. He's an expert in applied cryptography and network security, and he's also a professor at Johns Hopkins University. So just as a little bit of background, we thought a lot about where we should try to do a talk about backdoors, and we thought Black Hat would actually be the perfect place for it, because the people who come to Black Hat have very deep technical understanding, and they're also interested in policy. So let's have at it. So there'll be just a little bit of overlap between some of the issues that Matt addresses and some that I address, but hopefully you'll hear them from a different perspective from each of us, and it'll still be worth hearing it in that context. As a little bit of a disclaimer, I have to give one because I am an attorney, and these issues are really contentious. I'm not here to represent or speak for any particular interests, either the technology companies or the government. And I'm going to set forth the issues as I think perhaps we haven't looked at them before in a way that might be useful to us going forward as we try to solve this problem. As an initial point, I think we need to just define what we're talking about. The term backdoors has been used a lot. And it's, in general, one of the issues we have, one of the problems we have with this debate is that nothing's very defined. Everything's very abstract and very conceptual, including the concept of a backdoor. What do we mean by that? Just for the purposes of this talk, so that we're all on the same page, when we talk about a backdoor, we're going to refer to everything and anything between weakened cryptography, key escrow, split key, account mirroring, and so on. All of these are methods of providing what has been called most recently in the under Doormat's paper, if you've seen that, as exceptional access. That is a method for an authority, perhaps a government or a law enforcement, to obtain information from a system that it wasn't intended to have by the system's design. With that in mind, just as a point of clarification, it's worth pointing out because even experienced journalists in this space often make a sort of a conflation between end-to-end encryption and device encryption. And it's worth pointing out that these are two completely different systems, and the legal issues and the policy issues and the technical issues that are implicated by trying to obtain exceptional access to either of these systems are completely different. For the most part, in this talk, we're going to be focusing on messaging systems, so we're really talking about the peer-to-peer side of this. And the endpoint encryption between two endpoints. So with that, we still have a lot of competing interests that we're trying to reconcile in this debate. In one side of this, we have the technologists and the privacy advocates and the technology companies, most notably Apple. And the other side of this, there is the government interest. And the government interest has a long history of trying to find more ways to get more information. That is the other half of the debate. And there's this huge chasm in between right now. And the debate really seems unsolvable. So what we hope we can do here is provide a possible technical avenue that we might want to pursue that really hasn't been discussed much before. And we also want to take a look at some of the policy considerations in a new way that aren't strictly government access is bad or cryptography is good. Maybe it's more complex than that. So just as a little bit of background with respect to government collection of information, there are a few types of data that we'll come across in this talk. There's metadata, which is obviously it's the outside of the envelope. This information practically can't be encrypted because you wouldn't be able to deliver the message if it were under the current systems that we're talking about. There's ancillary data such as GPS and browser histories. And really, for the point of this talk, we're interested in content. And we see that mostly, and particularly with respect to messaging, such as text-secure applications like that, WhatsApp, as well as emails that could readily be encrypted as well. So who is asking for backdoor access? Unfortunately, if you're concerned about privacy, it's pretty much everybody at this point. In the US, there are calls for this exceptional access by the director of the NSA, by the New York County District Attorney, by the Suffolk County District Attorney in Massachusetts, and most obviously and publicly, the FBI through Director James Comey. Internationally, there's almost as much, if not more, to be concerned about with respect to the issue as the Prime Minister Cameron in the UK has talked about banning apps that aren't backdoored. China has recently passed a law that is reported to require that critical systems be secure and controllable. And Pakistan has Pakistan is now requiring that communications not go through BlackBerry's BES because that'll offer encryption functionality. And Iran has reported to ban WhatsApp. So this is a hot debate, and the stakes are pretty high. But with that said, is there anything new going on here? Maybe there isn't. The US laws have long authorized collection of all sorts of data that you might have on your phone or that you might transmit over a network. Relevant specifically for the FBI, in this context, there's the Wiretap Act and the restrictions imposed on that by the Fourth Amendment. So even James Comey of the FBI recognizes that the Fourth Amendment restrictions would equally apply in the context of whatever exceptional access might be made available. So just as a reminder, what this would require and would still require under even what we might consider to be the most objectionable of backdoor proposals here in the United States, it still would require that there be probable cause for a person to believe that, there'd be probable cause for the government to believe that the communications relate to an act that is being committed or has been committed that would be a felony. The government has to be able to show that there are no alternative procedures that would get it to the same place. There has to be probable cause to show that this evidence would actually show what the government's trying to show. So there are some checks built into the system, and these checks are substantially unchanged. And there's been as these exceptional access proposals have been made, there has not been, as of yet, a concomitant proposal to change the way the oversight of this works. We're still looking at the same Fourth Amendment restrictions that we've always had. Alongside of that, while the Fourth Amendment and the procedural controls are basically unchanged, there's been a long history of the US government seeking to control the way in which information can be protected such that it would not be able to read the communications. Shortly after World War II, the importance of cryptography was readily apparent to all who were paying attention, and the government instituted some initial export controls on that technology. In the early 90s, we saw the Clipper chip, which I'm sure most of you, probably all of you, are familiar with. In 1994, the Congress passed CALEA, which required that telecommunications carriers allow law enforcement access to their systems. That was also a direct reaction to changes in technology. Back when telecommunications would have been circuit switched, it was very easy for the law enforcement to just simply clip wires onto your system and listen to your phone calls. Once you had IP-based systems, then it was harder. So you needed to have more cooperation from the carriers to do it. And CALEA was the mechanism by which that was accomplished. But CALEA doesn't cover everything. It really is limited to carriers, even now VoIP carriers for telecommunication services, and it doesn't cover information services such as email and messaging. And that is that's a concern for the law enforcement mission. So in 2010, there was an effort to update CALIA to cover information services, and in 2013, the FBI, as you may recall, proposed requiring internet communication services providers to add in wiretapping capability, and even proposed fining companies that fail to respond appropriately to wiretap orders. So ultimately, we've got a regime where the government can get data. It has been getting data, but something's changed. And what is that? And that's been called going dark. And you might wonder, why is the government suddenly concerned about this? What is this sudden push that this is in front of us now? And I think the answer is really not much has changed. The government's always wanted this. People have always had means of, you could always use PGP. So what's happened is, as you probably noticed, the mobile. And if the reports are, if you believe Facebook, they've reported that their WhatsApp has now 800 million active users as of April 2015. That's a lot of people today. And if you just look not too far even into the future, it's pretty easy to imagine a world where there are literally billions of people using end-to-end encrypted communications for which there's no ready way for any governmental authority to review. And that would be different. PGP is often regarded as a user interface disaster. It's too hard, it's too complicated, and it doesn't work on mobile very well at all, if at all. But things like WhatsApp and TextSecure do work incredibly well, and the rate of adoption is fantastic. So it's a huge success. It's a cryptography success story, the likes of which few technologies probably have really had a chance to appreciate. And that's the concern. So from the law enforcement perspective, if you think about it, they were used to getting all the SMS they wanted, and now users are able to wave a magic crypto wand on their messages, sprinkle crypto dust across your texts, and now the government can't read them. So that's the cause for concern, and it's not clear how the government would possibly solve this problem going forward. So you may not necessarily believe the stories that the government is putting out there right now, the motivational tales of ISIS and child predators, a lot of stories that are meant to stir the heartstrings. But I think that's because they're just really not articulating it well enough, and they're stuck talking about the future. But I think if you believe they're looking at the long game, they probably do have a problem that they need to find a way to solve. So at the heart of the debate, you've got the technologists, the privacy advocates, the technology companies who don't want to be required to change the way their systems work, and you've got the government interests on the other side that would like to be able to access these messages. So there are a few key arguments that come up again and again in opposition to any kind of exceptional access system. And they can be summed up as such. That they break forward secrecy, and Matt will have more to say about the technical merits of the positions and what this really means. That they break forward secrecy. In fact, in the Keys Under Doormats paper that just came out, that was cited as one of the primary concerns. That was even a concern in the original key escrow Clipper paper from May 1997. Forward secrecy is a very big deal. And all the backdoor proposals that are out there right now that have been seriously considered, key escrow and key splitting and so on, break that. And that is I think everybody can agree that's a legitimate problem with the system. The systems that have been proposed out there also would break authenticated encryption, which is important, and there's a huge issue with who controls the keys. The idea is you would have some kind of master key that would be able to decrypt all the messages, or you would be a copy of a key that would decrypt your messages that would be stored in a central server somewhere, and this would become an administrative nightmare and a huge hacking target, and therefore practically not feasible. Legally, there are also some concerns, chiefly First Amendment concerns with asking companies, demanding that companies write their software in a certain way, and also oversight problems. How can you possibly have a regime where your communications are secured only until somebody decides they're not. And how do we decide who gets to make that decision? Is there a review process for that? Because it seems, based on recent experience, a system that could be ripe for abuse. And who knows if the government would hack its own key server to get the keys. It just seems like maybe an intractable problem, but one that maybe it could be solved if we worked hard enough at it. There are also some real practical problems if you try to mandate a backdoor. As Phil Zimmerman, inventor of PGP, famously said, if privacy is outlawed, only outlaws will have privacy. Certainly if you outlaw crypto, only the outlaws will have crypto. And that's a fair point. And it would be and it's pretty, I think everyone would agree that sophisticated criminal actors will not use your backdoor system no matter what. It's almost impossible. So if you are willing to accept a backdoor solution, you must also be willing to accept that it will not be 100% successful in its stated mission of allowing law enforcement to attain access to every single message that anyone ever writes. So maybe there's a sliding scale. At some point we decide we've gotten enough. Alternatives include the going bright proposal, which was advanced by Professor Belovin. The idea being that instead of giving out keys to everyone's messages, what you would do instead is allow the government to hack everybody's phone, which, as you can imagine, has a lot of technical complexity to it, and the feasibility of it could be questioned. You may also wonder if you really want the government hacking everybody's phone to get to the endpoint every time it wants a message, instead of just having your key and getting that particular message. So we're left trying to find a way forward through this. And the question that we need to be asking is there a way that we can reasonably satisfy all the interests of these parties, of the technologists, of the privacy advocates, and the law enforcement community, so that they can get the types of communications that they've always had until the proliferation of magic crypto wands. And what we have here is, I think Matt and I will have a debate about this a little bit later in the talk, but there is a proposal that's recently been advanced for how to backdoor a key server. And I think that this solves a lot of the problems and should be seriously considered as a potential solution to the problem. There is a technical solution, possibly, that's not as bad as what's been considered so far. That should be further investigated. And I think we also need to think further about what the point of no backdoors would be. So right now, law enforcement gets a certain amount of material, and they've been successful using this material in criminal prosecutions, but that's just a domestic view of it. And there's maybe the debate is really that if Apple had a backdoor in its device or in its messaging, then other countries, more repressive regimes, would also demand similar level of access, which then Apple would have a very hard time in saying no to. Right now, if Apple says no to everybody, that works great, and they can credibly do that in places like China. Once Apple goes down that road, it's a slippery slope, and everyone gets a backdoor. Is probably the way that story ends. And maybe the answer is, well, we're not going to get access to every email and every text we'd like to get, possibly if you're law enforcement here, in exchange for allowing a more free discussion among parties in other countries like China. Maybe that's the longer game that we should consider. So with that, I'll turn it over to Matt.
Okay, so one of the things I like about this audience, and I like about talking with Jim, is that, in normal technical audiences, you get kind of an echo chamber. When it comes to things like key escrow, I'm trying as hard as I can. Is that better? Can you hear me? When it comes to things like the idea of governments being able to intercept your communications, there is a very adamant libertarian, technical, sort of utopian streak where everybody says, no, absolutely not, it's not something we should consider. And that's not something that that's not a policy that we can actually adhere to. We have to consider the possibility that law enforcement throughout the world is going to ask for access to our communications. Can't really control that. Let's try that. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about the technical side of this argument. I don't know how much closer I can get at this point. And I'm going to talk about some of the tech and some of the history of these backdoor proposals. Maybe if you turn it down a little, it'd be better. So I want to go back. Let's talk about what's happening now. So a few of you probably saw, starting in 2013 or so, the Drug Enforcement Agency began asking for access to systems like iMessage. And they began to complain publicly in the press that they were not able to intercept encrypted communications with iMessage. A lot of people were skeptical. This made news in about June of 2013. Those of you who remember June of 2013 probably also remember why we stopped talking about this a few days later. This happened a few days before the Snowden revelations came out. So this entire issue got kind of pushed off the map, but it didn't go away forever. It came back more recently as the FBI began asking for access to encrypted devices. So there are these new encryption systems being built into Apple, and someday Android may get around to making it the default, so that we can actually encrypt everything based on a password we enter into a device. And this is apparently causing a lot of heartache for the FBI. Myself and a number of other scientists wrote a paper about why it's very difficult to build backdoors into systems like that. The FBI director didn't agree with us and said basically that, the scientists were wrong on this issue. I disagree with them on that, but I'm going to try to tell you why that is in a second. Before I do that, I want to go back in time. I want to go back to the late 1980s and the early 1990s when this entire original debate began. This is a period known as the crypto wars. And the thing that kicked off the crypto wars was this device here, the IBM PC, or maybe PCs in general, the entire collection that was available. What happened in the late 1980s was that cryptography went from something that militaries had exclusive control over to something that you could actually implement and deploy on a computer in your house. And that completely revolutionized our entire field. It went from being just sort of an academic theory field to something that ordinary people could use. I'm sure you recognize this guy, Phil Zimmermann, who wrote the first simple encryption program that you could use for email called PGP. PGP 1.0, I think it came out in 1990 or 1991. It was, speaking from a point of view with a little bit of historical, being able to look back, it was a complete piece of garbage at the time. It featured a cipher that Phil Zimmermann had invented called Basomatic or Basomatic. And let me just read to you some of the flaws that this had. So in addition to having some flaws where it was susceptible to differential cryptanalysis, it also had some more embarrassing conceptual flaws, like it failed to encrypt the last bit of every byte that was being encrypted. So it was not a good program, but it got better very quickly. And over the period of a year or two, Congress and law enforcement began to realize that they had a serious problem on their hands, that criminals could now use this to basically lock up communications in a way that they could not read. And so we saw a series of articles, I'm sure you recognize these guys, back in this is dated April 17th, 1991. Move on unscrambling messages is assailed. There were Senate hearings where people said, we need laws to actually outlaw these encryption mechanisms and to come up with alternatives so that we can continue to be able to read these and maintain, continue providing law enforcement access to messages. That entire sequence of events led to a handful of possible outcomes. I'll come to them in a second. But first, I want to talk about how this is replaying today. Today, we have all of the same problems that we had in 1991, except we have them in a scale that's maybe an order of magnitude greater. PGP adoption, while everybody was terrified of it, never got above about 2 to 3% of all email. Maybe that's being generous, maybe 1%. But today, we have end-to-end encrypted messaging, like iMessage, which has now close to 1 billion users, and we have WhatsApp, which is what this icon is, that has 800 million active users, where people, without even knowing it, are now encrypting their data. So the problem exists. We also have encrypted devices where people are using PIN codes to actually encrypt all of the data on their iPhones. So this problem continues today. So how do you go about solving this problem technologically? How do you break the unbreakable crypto system? Well, there are basically 3 answers. The first, obviously, is that you can ban encryption altogether. And this is something that countries have discussed at various times. It's not a good idea. I'm not going to try to convince you that it's a bad idea either, because our president has already weighed in on this. Fortunately, President Obama has basically said there's no scenario in which we don't want really strong encryption. And this is something I've spoken to members of the National Security Council who are a little bit ticked off about this because it basically constrains their options. They can't do anything that will actually weaken or break encryption. Another option is that we can find ways to make encryption that is so weak that law enforcement can somehow break it, but that individuals will still have enough security for their messages commercially. This sounds like a crazy idea, and it's a crazy idea, but it's something we've tried in the past. In the 1990s, throughout the 1990s, we maintained a rigorous regime of export controls, where what we did is we mandated that everybody encrypting their data had to do so with weak encryption keys. And we built this into SSL. And we said, if you're going to access a website, your server has to be able to support these weak cipher suites, these modes of operation that are not very strong. And then we repealed the export control laws. And we didn't take out the cipher suites. We left these export controlled cipher suites in there until 2015, when a group of researchers earlier this year realized that they had a way that they could actually roll back any encrypted website connection, any SSL connection, to use export strength crypto and then break the connection almost instantaneously, using about 8 hours of pre-processing on a computer and then about a fraction of a second's worth of time to actually crack the connection. And that was called the freak vulnerability. And these guys didn't even know what they had found. They had a vulnerability that they thought nobody out there was still using export controlled encryption. And then we did a scan. We found out that 35% of the internet still used this stuff. So weakening encryption has consequences that go well beyond what you think it's going to do. It's not a good idea. And later we found additional vulnerabilities called logjam. So weakening encryption, generally not a great plan. Which leaves us with essentially a third approach. And that is to design encryption systems that have specific vulnerabilities built into them that are essentially nobody but law enforcement will be able to decrypt them. These systems are called key escrow systems. And I'll show you roughly what they look like or have looked like in the past. One of these systems was included in a device called the Clipper chip, which gets lots of press. People talk about it all the time. This is the Microtronics, I think, version of it. This is what the packaging looked like. There's a lot of stuff going on inside there. There's a tamper-resistant chip in there. There are keys. There's secret algorithms, all sorts of nonsense. This was fielded as potentially the replacement for all software encryption. This would be placed inside of every phone and every computer back in the 1990s. It had a built-in government backdoor, so the government would be able to access your encryption. Now, let's look at how this was done. Clipper added a field to every encrypted message called the Law Enforcement Access Field, or the LEAF. What happened inside of that field was that the 80-bit session key that was used to encrypt your phone call or your email was wrapped up and encrypted under a special device-specific key built into your device that was called a unit key. The FBI or the Department of Justice had a copy of every single one of these keys. They were programmed into your device, and they had a big database, which was allegedly split into two parts, so two different agencies controlled it. So you would encrypt your session key under this unit key. You would attach to it the unique ID of your device so that the FBI could look up your device. And you would attach this 16-bit checksum to the end of it just to make sure everything was kosher. And you'd encrypt this whole thing under a global family key. Now, can any of you guys tell me what might not be so great about this? You can shout if you want. Are there any technical problems with this approach that you see right now? Yeah, global keys suck. Don't use global keys in anything. That means every single one of these devices had a shared key inside of it. And if somebody broke into one of them, they would have the global key that would let them essentially fake at least part of this message. Another flaw that Matt Blaze discovered in the 1990s is that there is only a 16-bit checksum attached to this thing. The reason that checksum is there, let me explain what that does. The fear that the FBI had was that people would tamper with the data going over the wire to either strip this leaf out or just to maul it so that the connection would still be encrypted, but nobody would be able to recover that session key from the leaf. So they added a checksum and they encrypted this entire blob under a family key so that if you tried to connect to another honest device and it was not able to decrypt this stuff and verify the checksum, it would refuse the connection. So in order to talk to someone, you had to send the leaf. That was the idea. But the checksum's only 16 bits long, which means that if you just make up random blobs of data, after about 65,000 tries, you're going to get it right. This is not a huge issue, but it means that you can basically make leafs that look like they're valid but contain nothing inside of them, meaning that you can now use a Clipper chip to communicate without a law enforcement backdoor. The impact of this was that after millions of dollars of spending, the NSA and the folks who designed this realized that they built a broken system. And they just abandoned the entire idea. Now, some say that's because the idea was kind of bad in the first place and they were looking for an excuse. But this is one way of doing it. If we look at how you do this with software, none of that will work. But you can build something that uses public key encryption, that essentially encrypts, let's say, a 256-bit session key from an iMessage session under some public escrow key where the secret key is held by the FBI. And if you talk to people in government, this is exactly the kind of thing that the US government is considering. The problem with this idea, though, is that at the end of the day, it relies on a lot of people getting a lot of things right. Those private keys, the US government has to hold a secret key. Everybody who implements this has to do it right. You have to worry about that key getting stolen and so on. So this is the proposal that's on the table. We may see this someday, but it is going to be very, very tricky to do it correctly. And then the last question, that last question is really the toughest, is who manages those private keys and who is going to make sure that no government agency hands those over to the NSA or allows anybody to perform mass surveillance. You have no real assurance. Once those private keys are gone, the security of every encrypted connection in the United States would essentially be compromised. So this design is very kind of weak. Last thing that I want to cover, this is going off on a slight tangent. In terms of breaking end-to-end messaging systems, there's one other approach you can take that does not involve adding key escrow. And as Jim mentioned, that's essentially to go after the key servers. Apple, for example, maintains a key server somewhere in their data centers. Every time I want to call someone or text somebody on iMessage, I send a lookup request to that key server, and Apple sends me back their public key. If they have 5 devices, I get back 5 public keys. I have no real assurance that Apple is really giving me back your public key when I talk to you. I trust Apple in that role. And if somebody was not trustworthy, if Apple was not trustworthy, they could very easily modify their key servers to give back an FBI key. That would be a great way to intercept things. This is the flow from one request. You can put a proxy in it. There's no certificate pinning. You can put a proxy in to see exactly what these key lookups look like. So at the end of the day, all of these systems right now depend on trusting your operator not to do this kind of stuff. So fundamentally, securing end-to-end messaging systems depends on you trusting your carrier not to get a secret subpoena from the US government demanding that they insert an FBI key. And that is the question, what is the legality of doing this, and can we really trust the government and companies not to do this stuff to us now? So with that, I'll hand it back to you.
So this was just a graphical illustration of how that might work. When you can see the surveillance is put in there as one of the parties, simply enough. So we had some questions that we wanted to kind of address from the technology side and from the policy side to see where we came out. And so one of to start with. One of the big issues that is always brought out is that it would be, and this was certainly apparent in the points that Matt made, which is it's very, very hard to make a system that would allow for exceptional access that wouldn't have some kind of either inherent flaw or an opportunistic flaw that can be found. And with respect to things like the Clipper chip, and key escrow systems, I think it's been very well established that these are almost impossible to do in a way that would make sense if you have, again, a global key. This is a huge target, both from a policy point of view and from a technical hacking point of view. But with respect to something like the key server, if you're going to do key injection on something like the iMessage platform, does that argument still hold water? That this would be either create an enormous target such that it would be unreasonably risky to do it, or are there technical impediments that make it unreasonable to request that it be done or try and make it done?
Can the government go to Moxie or to Apple and say, hey, we need you to insert these keys. We need you to modify the code of your key server. What is the law on that, and how much protection is there for companies who say no?
So these are the key issues that really haven't been solved yet. And I think until I think what we need to do at this point is to move forward and to try to spec out a system. Because right now everyone is shooting at a vague, amorphous target. There's no real proposal on the floor for how this would be done. Now we've gotten this, we're as specific as saying key injection. That's the whole system. And the question is, can you build it, and is it legal to do so? This is hard to say, right? We'd have to go a little bit farther. But I think from the legal point of view, you may need some additional authorities. Certainly there may be free speech issues with forcing a company to write specific software. Although the First Amendment is not a complete solution. If you just look at, for example, antitrust with Microsoft. Microsoft was not permitted to bundle the browser in certain ways, and there is no First Amendment problem with that, because there are other issues here, and code is not always speech. It's kind of a murky question. But that's something that's definitely an issue that would need to get resolved. And you may need something like an updated CALIA. You probably would. CALIA, as we were talking about before, allows law enforcement, requires that telephone companies give law enforcement access to their networks, essentially. And you may need something like that that says that for information services providers, which were not part of CALIA, that they will have to provide something.
So there are technical issues with this as well. One of them is that you can certainly look at the output of the Apple key server, let's say. If you have a piece of software that you write that can intercept and do what I did, you can see the keys that come back. Fred Jacobs wrote one. So it is possible for targets to see whether they're being surveilled by looking and making sure that they're not getting odd-looking keys coming back from a request. So there's always going to be this visibility thing, whereas with the key escrow approach, where every connection is fundamentally broken by design, there is no way of detecting when somebody's actually surveilling you. So there's some limit to this thing too.
Right, so that's another compromise that would have to be made, because presumably there will be people who will run whatever detection software it is, or they'll put something on their own network, even if it's not on the device. For example, if the Apple Store doesn't allow you to install this on a non-jailbroken phone, you may have to look at it in some other way. But there'll be people who are sophisticated enough to find out, certainly, that key injection is happening. So in order for us to accept that as a solution, we'd probably have to be comfortable with the idea that it's not a solution for all communications all the time. And I think that's really the compromise that we're headed towards. Law enforcement is going to probably have to accept that they're not going to get, because of the technical issues, that they're not going to get a global key to everything all the time. They're going to get something less than that. And they'll have to also recognize that there are some communications that will escape the decryption because of that.
So the concern I have about this entire issue is that fundamentally, once you start building systems that have this exceptional access capability, once you have governments being able to eavesdrop on anybody's communication on demand, that's a technical capability. There's nothing legal about it. So how do you build in safeguards? Well, you build in legal safeguards to make sure that's not abused. But then what happens when that same system that you've built and you've deployed inside of every phone in the country is sent overseas to governments that maybe don't have those legal safeguards? Are we basically giving a huge technical subsidy to the repressive governments of the world by building these systems and then handing them over so that we can chase a few child pornographers? Now, the BRICS countries will use this to do whatever they want. These are the things that worry me a lot.
Right, and that's a huge problem that can't really, and that's the slippery slope. Because once Apple gives a backdoor to the FBI, how do they say no to a backdoor to some other regime where we would all agree that maybe that regime is repressive, and we don't want those communications to be exposed in some greater public, global sense of what we think the world should look like. Yeah, exactly, in exchange for the little guys, right? Because the big guy, the clever people won't get caught by this anyway. So you'll catch a bunch of low-level people who aren't smart enough to avoid your system, and in the meantime, you'll allow China to completely own all the devices.
Yeah, so I mean, ISIS, if they need encryption, they will get encryption. It's really the folks using iMessage. I don't think too many ISIS members use iPhones, but maybe they do. But I don't think that they're going to rely fundamentally on Apple iMessage after they know that there have been systems that built in that allow the government to eavesdrop. So really, it is a fundamental question about who exactly we're going to be spying on with these systems.
So if there are any clever folks in the audience who want to take a hack at how you would backdoor a key server, I personally think that would be great. I'd love to see that talk maybe next year. So we've got a few minutes for questions. If anyone wants to shoot anything or throw anything at either of us, there are microphones out for that, I think.
unfortunately. The microphones are 20 miles away from where you're sitting. So.
I was trying to think of the physical world equivalent of this. Right now, if law enforcement agencies think someone is doing something bad, they will get a warrant and they will come search my home. And they don't ask my apartment provider to give them a key so that they could come look at it when they want. Like, why isn't the proposal to go after specific devices? Why are they trying to do it for everyone by default?
So I have a theory about this, and Jim can answer as a lawyer, but my theory is that our entire jurisprudence for the last 100 years has been shaped by the technical capabilities of the systems that we have now. So for the last 100 years of telephones, we happen to have a system that is very easy for a provider to tap because everything goes centralized. There's no way to build an armored cable that you can't tap into. And so it's just been convenient for us to build systems that have these kind of eavesdropping capabilities. Maybe if end-to-end encryption had come first, we would have made a transition from the idea of having papers inside of your home to papers outside of your home that are not available to government, and we would never have developed all of these intermediate eavesdropping kind of support laws and this jurisprudence around it. But that's just my theory, and I'm definitely not a lawyer.
Yeah, it gets more complicated once things are out there on the network, for sure. There's certainly a third-party doctrine which holds that once you put it out there on some third-party server, then it can be had. And there's the Stored Communications Act, which allows accessing of emails that are over 180 days old without a warrant. So the analogies to the physical space always get really problematic. So that's especially in areas things like hackback, we start talking about chasing being in hot pursuit of your data across the internet. So it's an interesting analogy, but they really are very, very separate. Which is why initially we broke out the iPad and the devices separately from all the stuff that we're doing on the network.
I've done a lot of work in this area, starting with a startup that failed about 20 years ago called Tristrata under Martin Atala. That system that we built back then was what Dr. Atala called a self-escrow system. But basically it was a key management server with also built-in policy so that keys were not handed out, data keys were not handed out unless policy was met, and authentication, of course. And the thing that was interesting was that we built into it the concept we had agents of various levels, top level and mid level. But we had special agents that were key escrow. These were people, administrator type people, who had to get together and bring together two shadow keys in order to access keys that were in the key management system. So every message that went out had I guess the best way to describe it was a certificate with the information in it, like an ID or whatever it was that was encrypted on, that key ID that was encrypted under, and those keys were all stored back on the key management. So if A wanted to communicate with B, A would contact the server, be approved under the adjudication process, get a data key that would be encrypted, throw away the data key, the receiver would get the message, there would be a little thing attached to the message saying he used this ID, this policy, whatever it was, go back to the server, get authenticated, get a policy approval to read the message, get the data key, decrypt it. Now you could come back later if that was recorded by an FBI, the FBI or whoever.
So basically, you're saying why can't that design work at large scale?
Well, there's a lot of problems. I mean, you've got accessibility. What if the server goes down? Now you can't access it. Well, okay, then you mirror it, you
I agree with you.
now you got synchronization issues.
These ideas have been thought through, and they've been done.
Yeah.
And I think probably the largest deployed key escrow system is the Forteza system, which I think does some of this stuff.
Right.
But that's not very big when you compare that to the scale of an entire nation or Apple's customer base. These are huge groups of people. The trust assumptions on people holding keys are going to be enormous, and you're not necessarily going to trust all of them, especially given what we've learned since 2013 about how much we can trust the government to eavesdrop us. So there are a lot of assumptions that simply have not been ever tested at that kind of level. So what works beautifully on a whiteboard and then maybe in a small system doesn't always work at the scale of an entire
Well, we deployed it to hundreds of servers, and it was actually very scalable into the hundreds. But when I look into it, I've been in this area for 20 years now, off and on. We're trying to deploy complex systems now with cryptography enabled. And fundamentally, setting aside the policy adjudication side, you've got key management now that's becoming extraordinarily complex because there's a lot of keys now involved.
Yep.
And I'll be honest with you, everybody in this room, myself included, I'm not going to go in and type in keys or try to remember this key was used here and that key was used there. You're going to have to automate it. And
Yep, and that's what these key servers do.
Yeah, they have to be scalable, they have to be synchronized and all that.
Yep.
But now you've got a centralized place if you're using key management.
And how do you deal with that?
And
how do you deal
there's
with
different things. You got the
vulnerabilities?
mobile world, or you got maybe people who are very involved with, in Iran, who want to communicate among, people who are against their government's actions. That's going to be a different type of system. But anyway, setting aside different systems, you're right. I think in mobile, we're dealing with centralized key management.
Yep.
And if they're centralized, that means they're accessible. They're going to be accessible to the government. And
Yep.
we have to design systems that can do that in a way that's not compromising, the.
I want to make sure
protocols.
there was somebody standing behind you. I want to
Yeah,
make sure they have a chance to
sorry.
ask a question.
I got off.
That's okay. Maybe, did that person want to ask a question, or were they good?
I'm on the other microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
That's all right. A couple of questions, really. So first, when you talked about cryptography, that's transposition, substitution, cipher kind of thing. How does this apply to something like a steganography? Is there a channel there that is also covered? And the second question would be, as we get more involved in this key, particularly at the billion-person level, who pays to manage all that?
So, the first answer is that we have no solution for steganography. Steganography is the art of hiding information in other information. We have no solution for that. We have no solution for apps. We have no solution for open source encryption projects. There's nothing you can do about those. That information will never be accessible. The best you can do is outlaw cryptography to the point where maybe you can detect people using those and then you just go after them on suspicion. So those things that's always going to be an open area. Now, in terms of who pays for managing keys, well, right now Apple pays for managing their own keys. Moxie pays for managing its own keys. That works great, but who pays for all of this additional work for building systems that support exceptional access? That's going to be very expensive to do securely, and it's not clear who's going to bear the cost of doing that.
From a legal perspective, is steganography covered under some of the acts that are coming out, or is it applied only to cryptography?
I think, I've not considered that before, but I think steganography would be considered cryptography. So whatever rules would cover cryptography should cover that as well.
But at this point, we don't know what the laws are going to be. It seems very unlikely you're going to have something that says PGP or a steganography program has to include a backdoor. You're more likely to see carriers be approached, and so they wouldn't be affected by that.
It makes a lot of sense to approach it at the carrier level or at the iMessage level with the key server because, of course, the fewer parties you have to interact with and perhaps compel to support your backdoor system, the better for efficiency and cost and the like. So if you're really just looking at something like WhatsApp, iMessage, TextSecure, things like that, if you just had those three key servers, you'd be doing pretty well. In terms of what you would cover. So one of the other points actually I wanted to make earlier about the perhaps advantages of the key injection is that of course one of the big criticisms of key escrow systems is that they're very subject to abuse. And once there's a master key out there, it's very hard to control who can use it when, and these keys persist. And that's a huge problem. And they persist going forward, and they persist going backwards because they break forward security. But if you did key injection, that does potentially solve some of those problems because you don't have to have a master key. If a warrant is properly issued for a certain person's communications or communications from a certain device, that key gets injected for that account, and then that key can then expire.
But what stops a government from escrowing every single person's key, from injecting a key into every single account?
I think what you have to do is you have to have, well, first of all, you need to build in enough oversight. That's a whole separate talk for some boring legal thing. We're going to be had some other time maybe. But I think if, to the extent they're using Apple servers, Apple in a sense could become a whistleblower on it. Obviously, they're not allowed would not be allowed to divulge who is being monitored. But if Apple announced that it had 8 billion fake keys, surveillance keys, then I think people might get concerned about where this is going.
Is that another person standing up?
I think, briefly, if I may, I think I take somewhat of an issue with the idea that key injection might be much of a valid solution, in that it relies on what is effectively a user experience design compromise on the part of Apple to take care of key distribution on your behalf, but that secure key distribution really involves the recipients validating that the sender validating that the recipient's key is that which he believes to be the correct key.
Yeah, so we trust Apple because we think we can trust Apple, but once we announce that you can't trust Apple, then nobody will trust Apple.
That's right. I mean, the design is not inevitable, right? Even Apple might decide to change the design in response to such an idea.
I do think that's one of the big problems with the idea.
Just one last note then, that is exactly that trust issue is part of the reason why these systems work so well. No one needs to verify their key with anybody else. We just trust it and it works and it's quickly adopted. If everybody had to verify everyone else's key, the adoption would be far less. So maybe we can exploit that user experience issue one way or the other.
I still wish you could verify iMessage keys. I think that's a dumb feature that they don't.
You should have it. I agree. We agree on this completely. Thank you so much for coming to our talk, and please fill out the reviews if you get that email.
Thanks.
Thank you.